Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with a bit of a themed reading vlog. So I decided to do a reading vlog centered around my reread of Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice, which I have always considered to be my favorite book of all time. This is going to become a segment on my channel, I hope, where I revisit old favorite books and reread them with you in a vlog format, because most of the books that I consider my all-time favorites, I read prior to BookTube, and I read very, very long ago at this point. And also prior to BookTube, I was much bigger of a rereader. I reread quite a bit prior to BookTube, and now I would say rereading is not as large a part of kind of my everyday reading habits. I very rarely reread anymore. This year I have made a concerted effort to come back to rereading, and I thought, it's been a pretty good success so far for me this year, so why not try and reread things that I know I love? So ultimately, I want to reread old favorite books to figure out whether or not I still consider them to be favorites. I want to apologize for this lighting because I am filming this quite a bit late at night, but I do think it adds a bit to kind of the spooky atmosphere of The Vampire Chronicles by Anne Rice. But to give you background on my relationship with Interview, it is a book that I think I very instantly fell in love with. It's a book that's very, very richly written. And if you don't know anything about Interview with a Vampire, it is about an interview with a vampire. A vampire sits down to an interview, and it's really, really fascinating. Our main character is Louis de Pointe de Lac, who is a very self-conscious vampire and a vampire who doesn't really enjoy being a vampire. He is somebody who really hates that existence. And so he tells his life story, and so a large part of the book is actually really historical fiction, because for a large part of the book, the vampires don't really seem at the forefront, and maybe they do to most readers, but I really love vampires, and it's hard for me to conceptualize them as horror creatures at this point because vampires have never scared me. I think vampires are attractive. I think vampires are sexy. And I always have from a very, very young age. When I was first introduced to vampires, I thought, why are people scared of them? So the fact that this book is often categorized as horror is interesting to me because I don't think the vampiric elements are at the forefront to my memory. But Interview is probably my most reread book. It is a book that I used to reread every single year. And I often used to reread this entire bind-up. I had this bind-up at my local library. And so I used to get it out every year in October or November. And I have very, very vivid memories of reading an Anne Rice book the day after Thanksgiving. I always kind of associate Anne Rice with the day after Thanksgiving, weirdly enough. I always remember kind of coming home from Thanksgiving dinner and settling in with an Anne Rice book, whether it was one I had read many times over or it was something new. I used to really reread her around this time of year, and so it feels appropriate to me to return to her at this time of year. I've heard quite a bit about Interview recently that makes me skeptical of it. A lot of the books that I think I'm going to cover in this series, I considered favorites when I read them. So I may have read them only once, and that once was probably over 10 years ago. And so I think I kind of have a fear about rereading favorites because I wonder if they will hold up. An Interview is one that I think is very interesting because a lot of people say it doesn't hold up. And so I'll be interested to see if that's true for me. I think it probably will because I've just had a very long love affair with Anne Rice's writing, and I think there's going to be a nostalgia factor for me here. And I can't deny it. I'm not going to deny it because I do think it's going to be a large facet of my enjoyment of a reread of it, because I do think I'm just going to kind of think back on those times that I reread Anne Rice. I have very visceral memories of reading this book in particular places. I remember reading it on vacation. I remember reading it on school trips. I remember reading it the day after Thanksgiving, and I remember seeing the film for the first time very vividly. I have very vivid memories associated with this book, and I don't think there are any aspects of it that I've forgotten. So at this point, I don't know if I'm gonna make this a spoilery vlog or not. I feel like I might have to make it spoilery. I will let you know in the next clip what I decide, but I think at this point, most people have probably read or at least know the basic facts of Interview with the Vampire and know the characters. And if you don't know Louis, who is our main character of this first book, you know Lestat, who is kind of the larger main character of the Vampire Chronicles series. So I'm excited to get started on this. I'm a little bit nervous. A good friend of mine, a colleague of mine, recently reread this, and he said it was just not as good as it used to be. It just didn't hold up for him very well. And so I'm skeptical. I hope it holds up for me, but I have the sense that it probably will. So hopefully as we go through this reread process, I can talk to you about Interview, and I can kind of tell you how it has come to occupy such a pedestal in my reading life, why it is the best book of all time to me. I've read quite a few books in my life that I would think on a technical level are objectively better than Interview. There are lots of books out there that are objectively some of the best books ever written, let's say. I think there are certain books like Great Expectations, some of Jane Austen's novels, a lot of classics, the Iliad, the Odyssey, that you can say are objectively great and are objectively better than Interview. But no other book has made me feel the way Interview did but Daughter of the Forest by Juliet Marillier. So hopefully I will have a vlog coming about that at some point. But that's when I am very nervous to reread because I've only read it once. The fact that I have reread Interview so many times, I've probably reread it 10 or 15 times, it does make me feel a little bit more secure with it. It makes me feel like I'm probably really going to enjoy it this time around. So I will update you as I get started. I do think I'm going to annotate it. So this is a bind up of the first 3 books in the Vampire Chronicles, Interview, The Vampire Lestat, and Queen of the Damned. And I'm not quite sure if I will just kind of continue on through the bind up, which is what I used to do when I was younger. So I'm really excited about this. Again, forgive the absolutely terrible lighting, but hopefully it has added to the ambiance. So I am currently 50 pages into Interview. I decided that I was gonna annotate it. I'm only using 2 colors of tabs, but they do have a meaning this time. So I am using pink and red tabs, if you can see them. The red are quotes, but the pink is imagery, which I think Anne Rice is a master at. So I'm only 50 pages in thus far, but I'm really, really enjoying it. And I'm so glad to say that. I feel a little bit relieved because I thought that maybe I would notice right off the bat that it was a weaker book, but it is absolutely not true. One thing I will say, and I think it's something that will probably bug people about Interview, and I think it's probably the reason that people don't like it, is that there isn't really much of a plot. When I'm sitting down to read this now, I do feel like the book is really essentially about the vibes and is about the kind of philosophical wondering about life, and it's very little about what is actually going on. The characters do things, but there's not really an overarching plot to what is going on. That doesn't bother me. I just really, really love the characters. So we have been introduced to Louis, of course. Louis sat down for an interview with a young boy who just really wanted to interview him. He thought he just believed he was a vampire, but now he knows it's absolutely true that Louis is a vampire. And so Louis actually lived in the late 1700s in New Orleans. He was a plantation owner, which is really fascinating. It's not something that I think I picked up on so much when I was younger, but it is now to me one of the most interesting aspects of the book, that Louis cares so much about taking a life, and he cares so much about, supposedly cares about other people. I don't know that he really does, but he cares so deeply about his soul and about what he's doing in life affecting his immortal soul, and whether or not God is real. This is a very big theme in Interview, is whether or not Louis still believes in God as a vampire, because if he does believe, and if God is real, he has to acknowledge that he, as a vampire, is likely a child of the devil and is sinful. And so there is this real grappling with emotion and with being good, but you're a plantation owner, Louis. So I've decided I'm really going to try not to be too spoilery, but because there's not really much of a plot, there are only a couple of elements that I think are truly spoilery. So I am going to talk about this kind of in general terms, but the first 50 pages, this is what's going on. So Louis becomes a vampire. He's telling his life story and how he became a vampire. And prior to becoming a vampire, he's somebody that really wanted to die. So he's somebody who was courting death. And essentially, he thinks that's probably why Lestat, the vampire that turned him, kind of was attracted to him, why he came on to Louis. But Louis is really putting himself out there. He wants to die because his brother died. And so this is setting up one of the big themes of the book, like I said, which is Louis grappling with God. And I think is one of the most fascinating aspects of Interview with the Vampire. It is so genuinely interesting to me to see Louis grapple with religion, because I think it is a very organic thing and I think it's a very natural thing. And I am shocked that more vampire fiction does not grapple with it, especially when you were talking about beings that are so old and beings that certainly maybe had different beliefs than we do nowadays. And Louis is from an older school. And Louis is still of the old school when we meet him. When you can hear when he talks, you can hear in this kind of interview session that Louis is still a very kind of older type of person. And he's not really moved into the modern day so much, which I just love. So the writing is really beautiful to kind of move on from that. But I do love everything that happened with Paul, who is Louis's brother. But Lestat did come in and turn Louis. That's where we're at. And Lestat is, I think for most people, the most famous character of the Vampire Chronicles. And he is kind of more widely, he is actually the main character of the series. And I've never really been clear on that. I know quite a bit about Anne Rice, but I think when she came back to this series, which was about 10 years after Interview, she wrote The Vampire Lestat. She must have gone through some kind of change to hone in on Lestat, and maybe throughout writing Interview, Lestat was the most compelling to her. But in many ways, Lestat became the main character of the series, but he is not the main character of this book. And the Lestat in this book is very unlikable to me. I never really cared for Lestat the way I did for Louis when I was younger, and I still don't. And on this reread, to me, there's a lot about Lestat that really bothers me, and there's a lot about the way that he treats Louis in particular that bothers me. But I did want to talk about her writing. I just think her writing is so beautiful. It is so phenomenal. So one of the things that I have tabbed was this moment when Louis is talking about New Orleans and how New Orleans has kept its character over the centuries. So this is going to be a bit of a longer passage, but I'm going to read it to you because this is why I love Anne Rice. This is why I love this book. It is genuinely my aesthetic. Everything about this passage, I think, sums up why Interview is a favorite book for me. This was New Orleans, a magical and magnificent place to live, in which a vampire, richly dressed and gracefully walking through the pools of light of one gas lamp after another, might attract no more notice in the evening than hundreds of other exotic creatures, if he attracted any at all. If anyone sought to whisper behind a fan, "That man, how pale, how he gleams, how he moves, it's not natural." A city in which a vampire might be gone before the words had even passed the lips, seeking out the alleys in which he could see like a cat, the darkened bars in which sailors slept with their heads on the tables, great high-ceilinged hotel rooms where a lone figure might sit, her feet upon an embroidered cushion, her legs covered with a lace counterpane, her head bent under the tarnished light of a single candle, never seeing the great shadow move across the plaster flowers of the ceiling, never seeing the long white fingers reached to press the fragile flame. Remarkable, if for nothing else because of this, that all of those men and women who stayed for any reason left behind them some monument, some structure of marble and brick and stone that still stands, so that even when the gas lamps went out and the planes came in, and the office buildings crowded the blocks of Canal Street, something irreducible of beauty and romance remained. Not in every street, perhaps, but in so many that the landscape is for me the landscape of those times always. And walking now in the starlit streets of the quarter or the garden district, I am in those times again. I suppose that is the nature of the monument. Be it a small house or a mansion of Corinthian columns and wrought iron lace, the monument does not say that this or that man walked here. No, what he felt in one time and one spot continues. The moon that rose over New Orleans then still rises. As long as the monuments stand, it still rises. The feeling, at least here and there, it remains the same. Absolutely beautiful. The relationship with history in this book, the relationship with age, with the past, that Louis as a character feels with his past self, it's just profound to me. There's something about this book that's just still absolutely spectacular. I'm hoping that I continue to feel the same way, but right now I am still feeling like this is definitely a favorite book. The question is it still my absolute favorite book? Is it still at the top of that list? Okay, your next update is coming from my Halloween corner. I have just gotten decorated for Halloween, and skulls, as you might can see, are apparently my theme this year. Here's my little skull. Up there's my captain. And this is a little cauldron full of skulls. I see now that they obscure the captain, so we're gonna have to move y'all just so that we can see him better. But I have some candles going, and so we're kind of in the spirit to be talking about Interview with the Vampire here. So I'm only 100 pages in, which means we got 250 pages left that I could continue to ramble about, and I know nobody wants that. So I am gonna kind of tell myself that this has to be spoiler free, but I did want to talk about a really famous character in Anne Rice, but particularly from this book, is Claudia. And so Claudia is a child vampire, and I have just reached the point where she enters the story. I'm not gonna really tell you anything about her. I just think her characterization is so interesting. I think Claudia and Louis, anyway, for me, are two of the most compelling vampire characters that I have ever read or seen, because they are really dealing with very deep issues that I think you would assume somebody who is immortal would deal with. And so Louis is, of course, dealing with, am I damned? Like, we've also reached a point in the story where that's really his prevalent thought is, if I'm a vampire, then I'm damned. If I'm damned, why do I care about people? Why do I care about killing people? Why is that such a bad thing to me? And so it's really an interesting dynamic with Louis. But Claudia also has that dynamic as a child vampire. And so, like, as an adult mind inside the body of a child and wanting something that she'll never have, which I think is really, really sad. And I think a lot of people struggle with Claudia. I think Claudia is one of the characters that people tend to really hate, weirdly enough. And this is gonna sound really cheesy and as if I'm giving this book very high praise that it probably doesn't deserve, but I really think Claudia is a very profound character. I think Louis is as well, but what Claudia deals with is so fascinating to me. And I think it can be a point of irritation for readers, but for me, it is probably the most interesting side plot or underlying plot in the novel is what is going on with Claudia. Claudia is 5, and in the adaptation with Kirsten Dunst playing her, she is aged up. And there's going to be a new television show around Interview next year, and I just saw that they cast Claudia, and she's also going to be older, I believe, and she may even be older than what Kirsten Dunst was in the original film. And I think that's smart, because to me, this is where maybe I've had the most issue with Anne Rice's writing thus far, is in the language that surrounds Claudia as kind of like a sexual being, as being attractive and beautiful, but like not in a childlike way. And I definitely think that past Jenny, who was originally reading this, and current Jenny too, I'll say I really feel this way. I don't think it is meant to be language that we're just supposed to accept. I think it is meant to be creepy and uncomfortable, because I believe the idea of a child vampire is supposed to be very creepy and uncomfortable for us to deal with. And so the language that surrounds her is definitely meant to make you feel a little bit squeamish. I don't think it's done with the intent for you to agree with what Anne is saying about Claudia. But I did want to include kind of my claim to fame with Anne Rice, maybe my only claim to fame ever. But I actually corresponded with Anne Rice once or twice in my youth when I discovered these books for the first time. I did a lot of research into Anne Rice, and this was in the early to mid 2000s. And I want to say when this exchange between us happened, it was around 2005, 2006. And so I emailed Anne Rice. This was in the days when you could find an email address that was a personal email address for an author on their website, and they would respond to you directly. It was not their team. And so I emailed Anne Rice about Claudia because I had done research on her, and Anne Rice and her husband, they lost their young daughter at around the age of 5 to leukemia prior to her writing this book. And Claudia came about a bit as a tribute to her daughter. And I think that's probably why I've always connected with Claudia, and there's been nothing about Claudia that really irritated me or that I didn't like in the story, because I knew that was a personal character for Anne Rice. And so I emailed Anne Rice about that and how touching I kind of found that story to be. She automatically responded to me. We corresponded several times that year, and I believe we told each other Merry Christmas that year, which was just really special for a young teen like me to talk to your favorite author and to get a really thoughtful and eloquent response to your message. It was just really, really amazing. Unfortunately, the email address that I had that on, has since gone under. It was on one of the many kind of email platforms that went under there in the late 2000s, early 2010s. So I don't have those emails, which is a shame. And so this is my reminder to all of y'all, please archive your stuff and print off things. Don't just do it digitally. Print things off so that you have a hard copy of them somewhere, because I would love to have those things again. I doubt I could ever get in contact with Anne Rice again, but that was so meaningful to me as a young reader. And definitely I think about it every time I think about Claudia. So I am slowly but surely moving through this, still loving it. I would say that the language around Claudia has been the only time that I haven't really liked her writing, but I understand that it's doing something on purpose. I really don't care for Lestat. I don't think that I ever did, really. But this time around, everything about him that irritates me seems like it is just in full force. And so it's just like everything he does is so terrible to me. And I think he doesn't stand up very well against characters like Louis and Claudia, because to me, Louis and Claudia are grappling with humanity. They're grappling with wanting things they can't have, never growing up, never getting to experience a human life, missing things that were human. And Lestat is just like, hey, it's great to be a vampire and I love it. And that's definitely a characterization, but it feels like it's a little bit one note compared to what Louis and Claudia go through. So I will update you again later, and hopefully I'll be closer to the end of this. I'm taking it very, very slowly, but I am just really enjoying being back in this world with these characters. Okay, interview update. I am officially 50% of the way through. I promise this will be the only other update I do besides how I wrap it up, because I know I have been waxing poetic about the themes in this book for at least 20 minutes. But I'm really shocked there have been so many smaller scenes that I completely forgot about. And so there's been like a nice element of discovery to me with this reread of Interview, because I have forgotten so many of these smaller vignettes. I won't tell you anything else about the plot because I am halfway through, and I think that you should read this and discover it for yourself. But I do see now how people get frustrated with it, because really at the halfway point, a few key things have happened, but nothing that I think the average modern day reader would really want in a vampire story. I think people would probably be on the hunt for more plot, but I just think this is such an interesting introspective look into a particular character. On the one hand, I can see definitely where people are saying Interview has aged poorly, and I'll talk about that at the end when I wrap up all of my feelings, but I can see why people say that. On the other hand, this book is still really great, and it's still, honestly, the best vampire book that I have ever read. So it's sitting for me right now around the halfway point. It is sitting for me still as an all-time favorite. So I actually did exactly what I told you I was going to do, and I decided not to update until I had finished the book. And actually, I probably wouldn't have updated anyway because I actually finished this really in like a fugue state. I just barreled through the second half of this book, basically because that's really when the action starts happening and you reach the point of the book where you can't put it down. But again, I kind of want to warn and say, like, if you are expecting something very pacey and plot heavy, or even something that really truly resembles a vampire story like we are really familiar with today, that's not really what Interview is. I think some of the other books in the Vampire Chronicles fit into that mold a little bit better, but Interview is a very philosophical and introspective and very slow novel in a way that some of the others in the series are not. And I think that's due to who Louis is as a character. I think there's also something to the series becoming incredibly popular, and then focus shifting into more of the Lestat realm, and Lestat is a more kind of vigorous and life-loving character than Louis is. And because this edition includes the first three in the Vampire Chronicles, you might can tell from where my tabs are, the Vampire Lestat and the Queen of the Damned are both much longer books than Interview. And I have to say that immediately upon finishing Interview, I automatically wanted to barrel straight into the Vampire Lestat. And it's not something that I'm going to allow myself to do unless I just really can't resist any longer. But wow, what a great reading experience. This book, honestly, was the revelation to me today that it was 15 years ago. Everything about the book still had the same life and draw to me today as I'm sure it did when I was an early teen. And so in many ways, I think had I just picked this up for the first time this year at 28, I think I would have rated it 5 stars the same way that I did when I was 13. But I will say that there are a lot of, criticisms around this, around the fact that it hasn't aged well. And I kind of want to get into that, and it kind of makes me wonder, had I read it today with no prior knowledge of it, but having consumed all of this other vampire media, how would I have felt about this? And so I think really when people say that this has aged poorly or is just not as good as they remember it being, I think it's because everything in Interview we have seen done so many times now in terms of vampire media, in terms of other literature, in terms of television shows and films. Because frankly, when we're thinking about it here, Louis and Lestat in particular are the blueprint for most vampire media that we are familiar with today in the 21st century. So generally, and I'll say, actually, Twilight is the exception to this. Weirdly enough, Twilight absolutely is the exception to this. But tell me one vampire show, film, that's kind of going for this gothic romance vibe that doesn't have a self-hating, brooding vampire and a vampire that absolutely loves it, embraces what he's doing, adores killing. Tell me one. Because really the blueprint for that is here in Interview. It's Lestat and Louis. Claudia as a child vampire is also the blueprint for other child vampires. Now that does show up in Twilight. To get off into a strange segue about Twilight, Twilight is a fascinating one for me in terms of vampire fiction because Stephenie Meyer claims that she never had any interaction with other vampire media before sitting down to write Twilight. She claims Twilight came to her in a dream. And so it's kind of interesting because in very many ways, Twilight is incredibly unique when it stands up against other forms of vampire media in the 21st century. Now, do I really believe that she had never interacted with it prior, that she'd never read Anne Rice? I don't know, because I personally think the idea of the romantic vampire was born here as well. But I loved reading this coming off of just reading Dracula. And last year I read The Vampire by John Polidori. And there was this massive scene in the middle of the book that, frankly, I'd completely blocked from my memory, that I had absolutely no memory of. But it paid extreme homage to Dracula as a novel, and particularly in a weird way to Polidori's The Vampire. In fact, I saw more of that in this book than I saw Dracula. So it's just kind of fun to think that we often think of Interview as kind of founding this modern genre of vampires, but it, like all other vampire tales, interacts directly with what came before it. And most vampire things today, films, media, books, they are interacting with Anne Rice. And they are often pretty straightforward and upfront about it, which I really appreciate. And in some cases, I think the figures that they cut out to fit into these molds, the fun-loving, happy vampire, proud of what he is, and like the brooding, self-hating vampire, some of the characters that they fit into those molds I like more than Lestat or Louis on an objective level. And I can imagine that for many people, that's probably also true, because in many cases, these were like television shows. And so you spent a much longer period of time with these characters. I'm thinking specifically Buffy, which I've actually never seen, but Angel and Spike, I think, embody these ideals, pretty clearly. And I think they probably exist more clearly to a person than Louis and Lestat do in a weird way. Stefan and Damon Salvatore from The Vampire Diaries, Bill and Eric from True Blood. I think some of these characters enter these roles and interact with those themes in more interesting ways than Lestat or Louis do. So I understand, I guess, is what I'm trying to say in this weird roundabout way. I understand why this has not aged well or isn't as good to some people, because we have been inundated with exactly what Interview is. We have seen it time and time again. And in some cases, you might even argue that it has been done better. For me, though, I'm going to say it, this is high praise. This is still the best vampire book that I have ever read. And I'm going to say too, I think it is still my favorite book of all time. I went through this entire vlog, through this entire reading experience, wondering, is it just going to be a favorite, or am I still gonna say this is the best book I've ever read? And as I said at the start of this vlog, on an objective level, is Interview the best? Probably not. Have I enjoyed it more and more frequently than most other books I've read? That's true. So it is, I think, still a book that I have to call my favorite. I think it is at least in the top 3. This reading experience was just so dreamy because the book is so dreamy. And I want to read you another of my favorite quotes. And this is out of context. I'm not going to tell you what's going on, but this is one of the quotes that I think will show you why I love Louis, and also why I love this book and what this book is trying to tackle with the issue of Louis being a vampire. So they're on a ship and they're in the Mediterranean. And he says, "I wanted those waters to be blue, and they were not. They were the nighttime waters, and how I suffered then, straining to remember the seas that a young man's untutored senses have taken for granted, that an undisciplined memory had let slip away for eternity. The Mediterranean was black, black off the coast of Italy, black off the coast of Greece, black always, black when in the small, cold hours before dawn, as even Claudia slept, weary of her books and the meager fare that caution allowed her vampire hunger, I lowered a lantern down through the rising vapor until the fire blazed right over the lapping waters, and nothing came to light on that heaving surface but the light itself, the reflection of that beam traveling constant with me, a steady eye which seemed to fix on me from the depths and say, 'Louis, your quest is for darkness only. This sea is not your sea. The myths of men are not your myths. Men's treasures are not yours.'" And then a paragraph down. "I never stepped ashore at Piraeus. Yet in my mind, I roamed the Acropolis at Athens, watching the moon rise through the open roof of the Parthenon, measuring my height by the grandeur of those columns, walking the streets of those Greeks who died at Marathon, listening to the sound of wind in the ancient olives. These were the monuments of men who could not die, not the stones of the living dead. Here the secrets that had endured the passage of time, which I had only dimly begun to understand. And yet nothing turned me from our quest, and nothing could turn me. But over and over, committed as I was, I pondered the great risk of our questions, the risk of any question that is truthfully asked. For the answer must carry an incalculable price, a tragic danger. Who knew that better than I, who had presided over the death of my own body, seeing all I called human wither and die, only to form an unbreakable chain which held me fast to this world, yet made me forever its exile, a specter with a beating heart. That's the kind of beautiful language that you're promised in Interview with the Vampire. And I am somebody who will tell you straight up, most of Anne Rice's books for me have been 5 stars. I have loved the majority of what she's written. Now, I've not veered into the territory of Lestat and the land of Atlantis. Even I have a threshold for weird. But this was the first of her novels. In many ways, it is the best. I think really you can say The Witching Hour, which is the first in her series about witches. I think The Witching Hour might be on an objective level better than Interview, but I don't think any of the rest of the series of the Vampire Chronicles holds a candle to Interview. Interview is so deep. Interview is really grappling with immense issues. What makes us human? Do we believe in God? If God is out there, how can he allow things like this, horrible things to happen? If we were given the choice to do something, we probably wouldn't do it, but shouldn't we still be allowed that choice? I think there's a lot in Interview. I think Interview should be studied in college classrooms. I would love to teach it. If I was a teacher, I would love to teach Interview. Interview is a dream, and reading it again now at this time in my life, I see how formative it was for me, and I see how it formed such a basis of my personality and how I got into certain aspects of history, and what about history intrigues me the most, and what about vampires intrigues me the most. I'm pretty sure the only reason that I ever wanted to go to Paris when I was younger is because of this book. The only reason I've ever wanted to go to New Orleans is because of this book. So did I answer the question? Is it still a favorite? Absolutely, it is. This was an absolutely wonderful reading experience. It was a great reread, and I really can't wait to reread other books by Anne Rice. So that was my reading vlog for Interview with a Vampire. I know it was very long and very self-indulgent, but I'm glad I did it, and I think I'm gonna be really happy to be able to look back on this vlog. So I would love to know down below if you have read Interview. I would love to know how you feel about Anne Rice, but that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.